Welcome to Chandwell. My name's Michael, and as part of the continuing build of the back of my commercial street, in this episode I'll be showing how I have started turning this mock-up into this 1960s concrete and glass office building. I've been doing a lot of cutting this week. Here's how I used 8 separate layers to make a 1960s office frontage. I was taken by this building on Dale Street in Bradford, just a couple of doors up from the Victorian building which inspired 19 Market Street. It has shops and cafes around the front, but around the back I like its concrete frame and its greenish concrete facing, which looks like it may once have been covered with some other material. The building is nearly all glass. The framing is very thin. In N-gauge, this building would need me to think of a different method of construction to that I usually use. Using measurements found on the Bradford City Council planning portal, I used basic rectangles in Inkscape and came up with a scale design which I printed to sticky label. I attached this to cereal packet card and simply folded the edges. Propped up on Market Street, I was excited because I think it works really well in its own right, but somehow it seems to bed pockets into the space and makes it less jarring to the other buildings. I decided to go for it. I could see on the mock-up that the lines involved in this building were small. Some of the elements, such as the concrete frame under the windows, are about 1 millimetre or even less, and can't possibly be added individually. I decided to use a method of layering, with each layer made to slightly different dimensions. This video is a story of those layers. Most of this building is glass, so I started with the windows. I printed the windows as grey boxes with a simple horizontal bar to represent a frame onto sticky label. I stuck this on top of another sheet of sticky label to produce a sheet 2 layers thick so that the frame bars have some definition. I usually make windows out of food packaging, but this building was too large for that. I bought 5 sheets of this 140 micron acetate on eBay for £3.50. It's quite flimsy. I wish I'd gone for something a bit thicker, but never mind. I stuck the window sheet to the acetate and used the sticky label method to cut away the grey rectangles to leave glazing. The real building has some internal secondary double glazing panels. I wondered if I could give the impression of those. So I printed another set of windows, but this time with thinner frame bars and in a different configuration. Once again, I used the sticky label method to reveal the glazing. I've never attempted a stick, cut and peel as large as this one before, and end to end this single sheet took just over half an hour to do. With the first put on top of the second, I thought that I might actually be onto something. The third layer was a traditional base layer. This one has windows that are 1.4mm wider and 2.4mm taller than the glazing layers. This should allow the smallest slice of white frame to be visible on the final model. I stuck this to 0.5mm card, and then carefully with a scalpel cut out all of the window holes. The bars between the windows are only 1.27mm wide. The fourth layer is the cover layer for the card layer. I could have used a glue stick to stick this to the card before cutting it, but I like to do it separately because cutting card can leave overcut marks which are easy to cover up with a separate texture layer. I cut this out in the same way as the previous layer. The concrete texture was downloaded from textures.com, but using Inkscape I coloured it with a slightly green tint. I added shading, a tile mark and the black dots of the Bradford building to add a bit more realism. This will be placed on top of the previous layer, like this. The real building's concrete frame is almost flush with the main panels, but there is a slight ridge. I thought I could possibly represent this by adding the frame as a separate paper layer. Another 54 window holes to cut. Once done, this will lay on top of the others, like this. The sixth layer is the 17 protruding vertical concrete frame elements. I stuck a plain piece of concrete texture along with some cutting guides onto 1mm card. Since the columns are just over 1mm wide and the card is just over 1mm thick, I should end up with some square section concrete girders. After careful cutting with my scalpel, I ended up with 17 matchsticks, and they are very delicate. I'm pleased that the card did not start to flake apart. I decided that I wanted the gap between the outer and inner glazing to be a bit deeper, so I created 2 more window layers. One had plain holes for the windows. The other one did too, but I decided to have some fun and add a message in the top windows. Using rectangles the scale size of A0 paper, I arranged an Officers to Let message on the top floor and just cut around these using the usual sticky label method. I was really pleased with how this worked out. So with 8 layers of building in hand, it was now just a case of sticking it all together, one on top of the other. I used PVA glue on the card base layer. Using a scale model scenery right angle jig, I carefully added the first paper layer on top. Not bad! The frame would have some exposed paper edges, so I carefully used a grey watercolour pencil to colour in those edges. Once done, I glued this on top of the building in the same way as the last layer. The 1.27mm thick matchsticks were next. Thankfully, the card is about the same colour as the concrete texture, so I didn't need to worry about painting it or colouring in the edges. I did use the watercolour pencil to remove the white edge of the paper cover though. I applied a thin bead of PVA using my ruler as a guide, and then dropped the matchstick into place using the jig to keep the top in the right place. The ruler and tweezers then kept it all aligned and straight. I was pleased with how this was turning out, even though I got one of the columns glued on backwards. Whoops. I used PVA glue on the first layer of glazing and attached this in the same way as the other layers. The flimsy acetate went a bit wavy here, and I did wish that I'd gone for thicker, but I did the best that I could. The next layer was added in the same way, and the next. I glued the final layer on backwards to enhance further the distance between the 2 panes of glass. I didn't think PVA would work here, so I used a bit of the devil's own glue, Oohoo, and finally it was all glued down and squashed under some heavy books. The building has a very thin horizontal frame under the windows. I'd left an extra 3/4mm for this. Using the rectangles of card from the windows, I chopped them into 1.5mm slices, which I then painstakingly slotted into the gap that was waiting for them at the bottom of the windows. This has produced a really convincing lattice grid frame for the building. On really close inspection, the frontage is a bit wavy, but I think that this will flatten out when I glue it to the actual frame of the building. I'm really pleased with the way it went together. There was a lot of cutting, but nearly the whole construction was simple. I avoided visible paper edges and have ended up with a convincing frontage that should be a familiar sight in almost any UK town. Keeping the window apertures of the outer layer just a fraction of a millimetre wider than the frames underneath allowed me to keep all the windows and frames in alignment and with just the right amount showing. They really do give the effect of being delicate metal frames in the elegant concrete frame. I now need to turn this into an actual building. With this much glass on show, I'll need to think about an interior, and maybe a mirror back wall to suggest depth, like I used in the ballroom on the hotel. All that will be in my next video, I hope. In the meantime, here's a look back at my station, which also has an interior. So until the next episode, thank you for watching, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.